Well, welcome to this, the second in a series of Juro webinars, this time talking about the rise of legal operations, and in particular, how we can design data-driven legal processes. The slides will be shared tomorrow, and this session has been recorded as well. And if you have any questions as we go, please just drop them in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer them in the 10 minutes at the end of this session. So I'm delighted to be here with Sarah Barrett-Vane, firstly, in London with me. Sarah was originally with Royal Mail, which is the UK National Postal Service, working on legal operations, and is now a legal operations consultant in her own right. Welcome, Sarah. Also with me, dialing in from the US, we have Lucy Endel-Basley. So Lucy was originally with Microsoft, and over the course of a number of roles has become an established leader in the field of legal operations, lately working with Inno Legal Services and also as chief legal strategist of another legal tech business called Law Geeks. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you very much.
And finally, Stephanie Corrie. So Stephanie was the co-founder of Clock, which is probably the leading organization in the world for legal operations, and is now a general partner at Up Level Ops. Welcome to you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
So in terms of this webinar, we're going to be looking at a series of questions and discussing those questions with the panel. Broadly speaking, there are 5. So the first being simply, what is legal operations? So within the US and Europe, legal operations clearly on the rise, but why does it matter? We're going to be covering how can you yourselves in an in-house legal team build processes that are data-driven? And equally, how can you change the perception of the legal team working with your internal clients like HR teams, sales teams, and other stakeholders? And then it comes to the money. How do you get buy-in to make these legal operations projects actually happen? And finally, what is the legal team of the future going to look like, looking ahead from where we are today, and in particular, how legal operations can help shape that? So the first thing we're going to cover is, what is legal operations? So I'm going to hand this to Stephanie as former co-founder of Clock. I can think of no better person to talk through this. So over to you, Stephanie.
Great, thank you. Legal operations is really the business approach to managing any legal department. And so what we're finding is that more and more companies are realizing that it doesn't always make sense to have lawyers running every aspect of the legal department. It's not what they went to school for. It's not what they want to be doing. And so stratifying that work and moving away the business functions like financial planning, technology, vendor management, liaising with the other departments within companies. It's a really critical role. It's the running of the legal department. You have to have it. It has to be done. And we're seeing it being done certainly at large companies, but even at very, very, very tiny companies. And so it's really a critical function, but it shouldn't necessarily be run by somebody who's practicing law. You want to pull that away from the people who should be doing the substantive practice of law, and have somebody who has this knowledge, this experience, and desire to constantly improve processes and run things really efficiently. You want to move those functions to somebody who's really skilled in that area, and that's all that legal operations is. It's the business management of a law department.
And we can see on the slide there some of the various competencies. I think this is an image actually from Clock. So some of the competencies there which cover various things. And I think often there's a perception that this is about vendor management, which tools are you going to buy? But it seems it's much more than that.
That's right. It's much broader than that. It's really anything that has to do with anything that's not the substantive practice of law. That's really what operations managers are running. So it's what is going on? What's the type of work that's going on in your department? It's employee in development and training. It's a lot of HR. It's employee morale. It's and of course it's liaising with the other departments within the business. It's having a communication strategy for the legal department. It's what kind of story is the legal department going to tell to the senior executives, to the clients, and all of that. It's you typically have somebody running that function and managing those types of communications and relationships.
And a question maybe to Sarah here in London. So you've been there on the ground as a director of legal operations. Why do you think this has become such a popular part of teams, certainly in the US and now increasingly in Europe?
I think there's a growing understanding over the last, say, 6 years in the UK and much longer in the US that GCs, rather like Stephanie says, are exceptionally busy people actually dealing with the legal affairs of the company. And for them to deal with the law, risk management and compliance, and every single coloured spoke of this wheel is far too much to ask. So I think, and also with the pressure on costs, which doesn't apply to every company, but does apply to an awful lot of companies, both private and public sector, there's an acknowledgement that if there's going to be this downward pressure on costs and becoming more efficient and more effective, all of these coloured circles need to be looked at, and the GC can't do it, may not even necessarily have the right skill set. So for him to bring in a number 2 as a director of legal ops is really the most sensible thing to do.
Great. So we hopefully have an understanding of what legal operations is and why it's becoming popular. And now to dig into the detail. When we think about data, this is obviously a hot topic in legal at the moment. People talk about this idea of legal data. But what do you think, speaking here to Lucy, what does it really mean to you to be a data-driven legal team?
So the thing about data, which is interesting, I think right now, is yes, there's definitely a lot of excitement and interest in it, and rightfully so. It's kind of about time. Certainly those of us on this webinar, I think, would agree that it's about time. What's nice about creating a data-driven culture in a legal department is that the data can be about kind of very different aspects of the department's work. It could be about the actual legal work itself. Data around litigation matters and findings and solutions and outcomes of actual, legal work. Or on the commercial transaction side, negotiation outcomes and kind of tracking information around certain provisions and negotiation outcomes on the one hand. On the other hand, much less maybe touching or impacting the day-to-day job of the attorneys is the data around the operational aspects of the department. How many litigation matters are out there? How many transactions flow through the department? How long do they take? Obviously, how much is spent by the department, whether with law firms or other providers? So the type of data can vary and does vary across departments, really depending on their priorities and frankly, their appetite to first of all, access and track the data, which is hard enough in many cases, but also their appetite in then using the data and allowing it to impact the way they operate. So what's nice about it is it's kind of an open field, and starting to collect any kind of data is frankly quite exciting and rewarding once that step is taken by the legal team.
And in terms of kind of working with legal teams, maybe a question here to Stephanie, but when you're working with teams, and we're thinking about to the last question on this slide, how to practically equip them to use data in a meaningful way, what does that change management process look like, and kind of what skills need to be taught in to enable lawyers to be comfortable with data?
Yeah, the one question we always get is, or it's funny when we talk to clients, and I certainly saw this when I was in-house, was this hesitation about metrics and data. And I think so you could always see this hesitation because especially as people just start down the road, they're almost afraid of what story the data is going to tell. And so you almost see the GC saying to me, but what if I don't like the story? And my response is always, it's okay. You don't have to share the data with anybody, but it is critical for you to know what is going on in your department. How are you supposed to run your department if you're not measuring things? If you don't know, you're just going by gut instinct, right? Like, I think we're doing this. Well, how do you know? And so I think how you really start to get it kind of ingrained in the DNA is that you have to get the deputies on board. So the people over each practice area, there's going to be metrics that come out of each of those practice areas. So for instance, contracting, Lucy can speak to this certainly better than I can, but there's all kinds of metrics that you're going to want to pull out of your contracting system. How many contracts are you processing? Who's processing what? What is the cycle time? et cetera, et cetera. You know, once we have the contracts in the repository, what's going on with all of those contracts? There's tons of data there. Spend, of course, like Lucy was saying, there's tons of spend data to be had. There's stuff from ethics and compliance that you should be looking at. There's metrics from intellectual property. So there's all kinds of metrics over each practice group that you should be looking at. And what I would recommend is having each of the deputies take a look, figure out what the 2 or 3 or 4 metrics they think are most critical and start tracking those. And then those metrics will tell a story, and they can begin to, you know, either drop some of the metrics off that they're not using and start tracking other things. But more will be revealed. It's one of those things that as you start looking at things, oh, okay, now I see that this is going on. Well, let's take a look at this. And so it happens very naturally and organically, but I would recommend talking to the deputies to get them really interested in, okay, what are the things you want to be looking at in each of your areas? And then they'll drive that on behalf of the general counsel.
Makes sense. And I mean, Sarah, in terms of the way in which you see your clients kind of getting to grips with data and understanding, is it just a mindset change, or are there kind of very practical skills gaps you see?
I think it's both. I think, like Stephanie says, some people are afraid of what the data will show. Often, and particularly this is in the UK, there are skills gaps, and also they won't be resourced to deal with this sort of thing. You know, that most in-house teams, particularly over here, are primarily lawyers, and you know, they might have the odd PA or assistant. If they're lucky, they might have a paralegal. Only the very large companies will have invested in legal operations staff or data analyst or legal project managers. So you might have, if you're a smaller team, say a keen admin assistant or paralegal who's willing to even open up an Excel spreadsheet. And to be honest, you know, speaking from my experience, some people even in the legal profession are scared about Excel. So to get them even to record spend or data in an Excel sheet could be the first step. Then ideally, if you can get someone trained on that and get them doing pies and graphs and something that can be actually shown viably to say the CFO or whoever wants to see it after the GC, then you should go further and look to see who do you actually need to resource this. But sometimes just starting with the basics is you know, provides a little bit of a comfort blanket. Just do very baby steps and move on from there.
And Excel is a very powerful tool. It's a big jump. I'm a former lawyer, but going from Microsoft Word to Microsoft Excel, shifting yourself through the Office suite is scary. But as you say, there's lots that can be done even within that.
Yeah, and ideally then you'd move to buying some tech if you could. But at the very basics, I do meet people who are quite scared about even, you know, I just still ask the law firms for invoices, which I think in 2018 is not where we should be. So even if you start with a spreadsheet and get someone to analyze it properly to create some pretty looking data and metrics, then that's the start. And then we need to move on to think about becoming more sophisticated.
And maybe a question here for Lucy, but when we talk about which types of data are most useful, sort of coming out of that, how do you prioritize within a legal team kind of what to go after? There's obviously kind of data you can capture, but how do you prioritize within the team? How do you make those decisions?
So, you know, the way I always think about it is you're going to want to go the path of least resistance, basically. I mean, oftentimes that starts with the pain points. When you identify where the greatest pain is of the department, and usually somebody in the leadership role there has identified it and wants to do something about it, that would be the best place to start. And oftentimes that's in areas of, you know, spend, for example. You know, if that's a high point of concern, then that is a great place to start. So when you say prioritize, I think it's very unique to every department. I would never be one to say that it's important. The most important thing to understand is your spend in the legal department. It really just may not be to that particular department or that particular you know, corporate entity. On the other hand, what might be most important to them is to understand how many pieces of litigation have they had in the past year. What, you know, they should have that number readily available. They should have a number readily available of, you know, how many are pending at any one time. Again, if they are in a highly litigious area and that's of concern to them. So I think understanding the corporation's culture, their drivers, their, you know, concerns, certainly their industry, I think that all comes together and helps prioritize, because there really isn't one right answer, just like there is no one definition of legal operations at any one corporation.
And it makes sense. I mean, we spend a lot of our time talking about solutions, and you read the media, it's always about, you know, what technology is out there. Often the important thing is to decide what the pain points are and what the problem is to be solved. And I think with legal operations, it seems no different. And perhaps this is a good segue to jump into the perception of the legal team, and specifically the tactics and strategy that can be used to enable a different perception based on showing some data. So starting with that first question, question to Stephanie, how can you use data to prove your wins and highlight the legal risks? I think we have Stephanie offline, so we'll just go to Sarah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was on mute. I was just saying further to what Sarah said about clients, you know, really kind of being afraid to see what the data is going to show. And I've certainly experienced that as well. I think the critical thing is just getting a starting point. And so the data is going to show where you are today. And I've not yet seen where people haven't made progress. Maybe you don't make progress in every single area all of the time. It's not a linear progression, but I promise you that if you start collecting the data and start acting in a certain way that moves that data, you know, what you measure, behavior is going to change if you start measuring it. I guarantee that. And then if you just look a year later, you're going to see the progress that was made. And so if it's focusing on, you know, getting better spend controls in place and, you know, doing things like obviously e-billing, convergence programs, value-based pricing, once you start doing those things, you're definitely going to see a change in your spend. If you focus on improving your contracting process and you see where you are today, and you take those steps to improve your contracting process by next year, that those numbers will look different. And so you will be able to say, look, this is the progress that we've made. Over 3 years, it's going to look even better. Over 5 years, it's going to look amazing. And so every place I've ever worked over the course of several years, you were really able to show the progress that you've made.
And can I just, and adding on to that, things like proving wins, I think are really important. You know, when a lot of the legal team have been quite backward, I think, in coming forward with their wins and successes, they're not as good at shouting about their achievements as other departments within the business. And once you have data on things like, for example, as Lucy was referring to litigation heavy, or if you're litigation heavy, you know, how many claims have you got? What damages are you paying? How have you reduced those damages? What savings have you made? Things like data on number of training days you've given to the business, both in-house and with your externals, so you can actually give your external firms a bit of a win here. Things like, you know, selling properties, making a load of money, making more money than you thought you'd make, it's gone to the bottom line, you've made X% over the original projection. And then, as Lucy talks about contracts, time to negotiate and conclude, I think any savings, the way I look at it is if you can say things like, it cost A, it used to cost B, that's a saving of D or E%. Anything that puts it in pounds and percentages for things for people like the CFO to understand, I think is a really useful win for legal. And it's something that most lawyers are uncomfortable with doing, but people from legal operations background or procurement or finance are very comfortable talking about percentages, wins, and pound signs and dollar signs. So I think wins are really important, and you can only do that with data, because data is facts and figures, and it tells a credible story.
And
I'll add, Richard, I'll just add one more very concrete example that I think moved mountains, at least from my personal experience and the perception of the legal team, was especially at the example around contract turnaround time, where we've heard the lovely comments about, you know, legal is a black hole, you know, we never know what happens there. You know, there's just all those historical, uncomfortable references to trying to avoid the legal department if possible, even at times. And it's also oftentimes about lack of predictability. It may not even be that things are taking too long, or, you know, because there's no concept, there's no data, there's no, a starting point to even measure. It's just this discomfort with not knowing what to expect and that unpredictability. So to be able to collect some basic data around turnaround time and take it to the next level, and then commit to the business that, you know, we'll turn around your first draft of a contract in X number of days, that alone, it changes completely the perception from the business of the legal team. It really does, no matter what number you use. I mean, you can almost say it'll take me, you know, 10 weeks. They'll just be happy with the predictability, I'm afraid, because they're just oftentimes not accustomed to that. So that's a very real example, and something that frankly isn't that hard to accomplish in any size department if that's a kind of a baby step that somebody would be interested in. But the business is, it's amazing how the nature of the relationship changes just by providing that some basic data on that.
It's kind of interesting because the narrative has often been around legal moving from being a blocker to being an enabler, which most people seem to agree with, but there seems to be a little bit of a gap in the narrative around, well, how do you actually improve that? So I don't know, Stephanie, whether you have examples, maybe anonymized examples from your past life, where you've seen this actually being proved out.
Yes, well, what I've seen more and more, which has become, it's almost the pendulum swinging to the other direction. Before, certainly when I started at HP, I mean, this is back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the lawyers were being pulled in at the very last minute to basically sign the contract. And it created all these problems because, of course, then they're saying, whoa, 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 we have to understand what you're trying to do here, and we don't think this is a good idea, et cetera. But it was definitely a case of people trying to circumvent the legal department. They were seen as that department that always says no to people. Now, I actually work with clients lawyers are so involved in every aspect of the business that especially the smaller legal departments I work with who are overburdened, we're actually looking at the types of work they're doing and saying, okay, this is really, they're asking you to negotiate business terms. This is really on them. They're being pulled in now so early. And so, they sit on the attorneys, especially the deputies, sit in on their clients' staff meetings. They're invited to team offsites. I mean, they're definitely seen as an adjunct member of the team, and because of that, they're being asked to use their expertise on areas that are not necessarily legal. And so we actually work with, it's definitely a balance though, because you don't want to be telling your clients, look, this isn't my job. You want to be involved very early. You want to be seen as a business partner. And so now it's the shift has happened pretty quickly and to such a degree that now we have to work with general counsels to say, okay, you're going to have to push back a little bit here because you're getting overburdened doing these non-substantive legal types of work. And so I'm curious to see if Lucy and Sarah kind of have a similar experience with their clients that actually I'm seeing firsthand that lawyers are being pulled in very early and now are truly seen as business partners as opposed to the people who just sign a contract at the end of the whole thing.
I think perhaps interesting to put that to Sarah. So obviously on this side of the pond, there are various kind of cultural differences in business. Is that something you're seeing reflected over here as well?
The ideal situation is where lawyers are brought in early on. But I think one of the results that you get when you get the data of what work are people doing, why are they doing it, when are they doing it, how could they be doing it differently, is that you can see that what we would call over here the churn, and you may have the same, the McDonald's work, if we're being a little bit impolite, the churn work that maybe shouldn't ever get to a lawyer. Once you find out that your lawyers are actually doing 72 of these a month, you begin to say, okay, so that's not what should be happening. So what's the solution? Because the question should always be, what's the problem? What's the solution? So do you then think about employing someone else or scaling up the business and sending it back to them, or bringing in a contract automation tool or something to take it away and put it down a tech route? So I think it goes back to the point that once you've got the data, it's so valuable because it tells you what people are doing. Then you can investigate, maybe not the why question because people can get defensive, but almost like, okay, so that's the way you do things. Is there a way that we could do things differently and better? And also, of course, once you take the lawyers away from the churn work, you take them higher up the food chain, give them more valuable and interesting work, and get the churn work done cheaper and more efficiently by a different route, which should also make the business happy. So, yeah, it's...
And I mean, from outside perhaps of the kind of commercial structures, I think that's clear. Within the legal team itself, have you, and any of the panel, have you got examples of seeing greater levels of employee satisfaction and engagement within the legal team because some of that repetitive work is being done in a more efficient way?
This is Lucy. I mean, no doubt. I know in my experience, when we're talking about again, contracts, and every company has them. Every single company has them. Every single legal department has to deal with them, and most don't love that kind of unending volume of them, and they don't love kind of the noisy contracts. It's just a lot of I want to say repetitive, not because each one's the same. It's not that lawyers spend their time doing kind of work that's completely predictable and very repetitive, but there is enough of that when you lift that off their plates, definitely there is this feeling of relief, and then they can spend time on much more interesting work, which is what they want to do but oftentimes can't get to it. So I've seen it firsthand. We went with a global program actually, and it was oftentimes many of the attorneys that were in the smaller subsidiaries in Microsoft's case, because they were completely overwhelmed with so much work, so many different types of issues that they were dealing with, oftentimes being the only person supporting an entire country or supporting up to 23 countries in some cases, that to be able to lift some of that, more repeatable work off their desks was really a direct, big benefit to them. And that was very rewarding to get that kind of feedback.
And maybe to Stephanie, I mean, to the question, what are the risks if you don't gather and use data? I guess maybe in the broader legal operations context, what are businesses missing out on if they don't go down this route and really get legal operations right?
I think, back to my earlier point that you're managing based on anecdotes, which can be very risky and inaccurate. But further, if you're not telling a story of what's going on in your legal department, at some point you risk the chance that the CEO, the CFO, somebody is going to tell the story for you. And so we've seen that many times where we actually had a smaller client who thought they didn't need e-billing, though they had about 10 million in spend. I encouraged them to get some type of financial structure in place but they didn't feel that they needed it. Sure enough, procurement came to them, told the CEO that they were spending close to 20 million. And she had no way to prove that that wasn't right without going back to all of her law firms, trying to pull data from them because finance had inadvertently assigned some data to them some bills to them that didn't belong to them. And so she had to recreate all of this. It took weeks to pull all of this together. She had to pull, people who were doing other things and direct them to focus in on this because all of a sudden it became urgent. And so now the GC obviously does want to implement e-billing and get some structure around this. So the issue is if you don't have control over what's going on in your department, I think you really risk somebody coming to you and saying, look, we believe this is what's going on in your department. And this is what we want to see. We want to see a 10% cut. We want to see, X, Y, or Z. And if you're not able to show different or show what's really going on, then that puts you at risk.
Do you think, Stephanie, I mean, within the context of, let's say, maybe a smaller business, so maybe not a multinational with, potentially hundreds of legal counsel, if you have a handful of legal counsel who are doing all this kind of heavy lifting work in addition to actually managing huge and real risks to the business, do you see a kind of busyness trap where in order to go and do this, so to go and gather data, to go and start being data driven, to train your team, to get them into Excel, potentially into other tools, do you think there's this trap of just never kind of prioritizing this work and just going with the day to day and being weighed down by it?
Yeah, if you don't have systems in place and you don't have a process and you don't have somebody managing it, typically it won't be prioritized. I would say that we see it being done in many cases. And so what we see is we worked with one client who actually, two of their attorneys were tracking every detail on an Excel spreadsheet because they didn't have e-billing in place. They like to see the data. And so they were taking their invoices and manually data entering all of these into Excel. And I see that across the board, that it's being done on an ad hoc basis because people do want data. There's no doubt about it that most people do want to understand what's going on in their department, so they'll start tracking things on an ad hoc basis. And then what you have is it's kind of a waste of time because you probably have the wrong people tracking and you're getting an incomplete picture. And so it's not like you're seeing the holistic, picture of what's going on. And so what I recommend is actually taking a look at, okay, what is it that you want to track? Let's take spend data as an example, because I do think it's one of the more critical things, and probably the first thing that you want to start tracking. Looking at that spend data, do you have enough spend to get an e-billing system in place? If you do, then that's going to take all of that tracking off of the plates of the attorneys, because it's going to be systemized. If you don't, if you just have a little bit of spend, does it make sense for one of the paralegals or EAs to just, data enter some of the top level data of the invoices? Or can you get it from your, financial system? What is available to you already? So I think it's really, it's almost dangerous not to be tracking these things systematically, because, not dangerous by any means, but what happens is you have people who do track, it's in an ad hoc form. So you're still wasting that time. I think that's at least, what I've seen. And so I think it's really critical to try to systemize that and make sure everybody's clear on what you're supposed to be tracking, and then push that down to the right people so that you don't have very high level people filling out Excel spreadsheets.
It seems like there's an investment to be made, and probably it only gets worse the longer you leave it.
Yes.
I think just to pause quickly, thank you to those who have submitted questions already. We're seeing lots coming in, which is great. Quick reminder that do submit them in the chat box as we go, and we'll try and address as many of those as we can in about 20 minutes time. So to move on to the next question, let's talk brass tacks. So you've got your legal operations project, you've got the team to buy in, you've equipped them, you're looking at tooling. What happens next, and how do you make it happen? Maybe a question first to Sarah. So from your experience in practice, what are the strategies and tactics that really make legal operations happen?
Well, I suppose that there are two parts to the question. In that, do you have a legal ops person, or do you actually need a strategy to get one in? And or then do you move on to tech? Because I always very much think, do you have the budget for a person and or resource? And then do you have the budget for the tech that will naturally follow from that? So you need a sponsor, ideally, of course, your GC. Better still, I think your CFO. I often think that if the operations person had a dotted line reporting into the CFO, you'd probably get decisions made even quicker, because they're so much focused on finance. How do you get the budget? Well, you've got to bring everyone on side. So you need a really strong business case as to, firstly, why you need legal ops people or data analysts or whatever, and or why you need the tech that will result from that. I think the first stakeholder, and I don't like that word, but everyone uses it, the first stakeholder you've got to bring on board is finance, because the CFO and your finance partner should be the first person that you convince on this. And then you're going to end up talking to perhaps IT and procurement if you want to buy legal tech after that, HR, and any of your business unit heads. So, to the examples about contract management or changing HR or changing processes, if you can get buy-in from some of your actual business heads, i.e. clients, for you to go ahead with legal operations resources and or tech, that's the best possible thing. Because I think what I really like is that you don't tell the story that this will make things easier or better for legal. This will make things easier or better for the company, for the business. And if you can get the CEO, CFO and everyone else on board thinking about the company as a whole, you're far more likely to get buy-in than saying legal would like this, because most people are probably still thinking that we're using filing cabinets, and why can't we just carry on doing that? So the idea of having legal, using sexy tech is a little bit avant-garde for some. So get as many people on board as you possibly can, and do a very good business case, which might involve, to be honest, getting a legal ops person in to do that for you if you're not already of that frame of mind.
Because I guess that's an Excel task in itself.
Yes, there's nothing here that doesn't involve Excel.
Yes.
You can't have a business case without an Excel spreadsheet and or PowerPoint.
Yeah. So identifying the right stakeholders, we heard about sales and HR. Maybe a question to Lucy. So coming from maybe sort of Microsoft-sized companies, what other stakeholders do you need to bring into the fold to go and make these projects happen?
I think it was really important for me to work with the IT department. I mean, they really are, the ones who I needed help from to implement certain pieces of technology for sure. Now, what's interesting is that I needed their help desperately, but it wasn't necessarily that they were critical in helping me get buy-in. So it was an interesting dynamic, as it often is in large corporate settings. They were necessary skill set for me to prove my success, to show some successful outcomes. But in order to get buy-in, it really was about having the practicing lawyers across the department understand the benefits. It really was a bit of kind of gathering of the masses rather than trying to do top down. Top down is always nice to get buy-in, and that helped. And at some point, I went that route. It was really a combination, as you can probably guess from all of our experiences. You kind of do whatever works, and what works in that corporate setting and in that culture. So, while there are these groups of stakeholders that we describe, these different departments, whether it's IT or finance or procurement, I think there is this benefit in getting kind of the practicing lawyers whose day jobs are going to be impacted in a positive way. And they're going to reap the benefit, but it's still hard for them to envision it, to get them, to come along. So that, power of the masses really helps sometimes if you could do that.
It's interesting. I mean, I come from the vendor side, so one of the things we see all the time is how people buy software, and there's actually no sort of set way of doing it. Everyone does it completely differently. So I guess thinking specifically about IT, maybe a question to Stephanie, but I mean, what kind of challenges do you see there? Security? Is it more fundamental? Is cloud possible here, or is it only going to be on premise? How does GDPR or privacy regulation impact?
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Richard? I want to make sure. It was cutting in and out, so I just want to make sure you can hear me.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, perfect. So when you say what kind of challenges, are you just asking in general for the legal department? What type of IT challenges do they face in proving, that they need this technology?
I think which challenges and when to involve them in the process.
Are you off mute?
I'm off mute, but I'm sorry, it was cutting in and out. So I'm sorry, I was asking if you could repeat the question. I just want to make sure I answer appropriately.
Which challenges and when to involve the IT team?
So I think it's for IT, I try to get them involved as early as possible. So Lucy was talking about, how critical that relationship is. I couldn't agree more. I think, in fact, one of the things that the operations manager really offers is that translation services, basically between the attorneys and IT, because what I found working in-house and certainly working with clients is that the lawyers think they need something, and they do in many ways, but when you pick their brains, you really understand that the tool they need is really something completely different. And so what we found is, they might be asking for a full contracting lifecycle management tool, but really as you dig in, they're expensive and complicated to implement, and it takes a long time, and it takes a lot of resources to do that. And really what they need is simply just a workflow tool with an e-signature or something like that, and a repository, which is far easier to implement than a full CLM. And so what I think the value that the operations team really brings is that really deep understanding of what the needs are in-house with their teams, and then liaising with IT to do that and see are there tools already on board that can be leveraged, and then making the business case if they're not. That's really where the challenge comes in, because it's difficult to say, look, we need a separate tool for legal. IT often, and the CFO and the CIO, it's often a tough challenge to say, sorry, but we need to spend a couple $100,000 on this tool. And then, that's where the ops manager really has to come in and explain what's going on. How many, manpower hours are you spending doing this manually now? Or how much are you spending with law firms doing this? How can you save money? How can you make things more efficient? How can you make things better for the clients? Back to Sarah's earlier point of showing value for the clients. How will, implementing this tool, changing this process, et cetera, how will that do that? So it's not easy. It's a lot of analysis, and they hold you to that. What I'm finding is it used to be like, you used to be able to say the ROI is 10% and that was it. And now they're actually holding you to that. They want to see those results at the end of the day. And so it's definitely, it takes some effort for sure.
And just outside of that kind of vendor context and the sort of tech projects context, if you're let's say a mid-level legal associate in an in-house team listening into this webinar, and you're convinced that legal operations is the way to go, how would you pitch that, Lucy, to your general counsel?
Well, that's always a fun experience and journey. I think, first of all, right now, there's definitely a curiosity around innovation generally, right? Changing behavior, changing how legal departments work. So I'm hoping most general counsel are interested in these kind of ideas. So, as far as the how, I would do my best to gather, again, data. I would like to be able to show, hey, I spend my time on, and it should be fairly easy if you're just talking about one person that is trying to make a case based on their, their specific experience. So they have at their fingertips as much information as possible around their day job. It's really great to be able to create a story around that and to pitch the idea based on, here's how my day job looks today, here are the changes I'd like to implement or recommend that we try, and here are the benefits. And then come with an ask, come with a specific request. Is it, do you need budget and what it would be used for? Do you need help? And what are those skills that you need help from, maybe across the department? But I think the better prepared you are, I think you're going to have a really good chance for success now, and especially nowadays, because there's just so much buzz in the air right now that now's best time, really better than any time before that I can imagine, for an attorney to actually make this pitch, coming from the perspective of, hey, I'm the practicing lawyer and I'm saying I think there's a better way I could do my job. I think that's a very powerful message.
I think so. I mean, I think especially given what we read in the legal technology press, which is certainly, it's somewhere in the Gartner hype cycle. No one quite knows where, but the sort of weary GC hearing from a mid-level legal counsel in her team, let's do AI, is quite a lot less compelling than, here is a basic model I've built, and here's how I can prove, with or without technology, how we can run our business more efficiently. Okay, we're going to just move on. So to our kind of final question for the panel. So looking ahead a little bit to the future, so rather than the state of legal ops at the moment, going through these questions, Sarah Barrett, will in-house legal teams contain the same roles in the future?
I think, ideally, speaking optimistically, I would like to see more other professionals other than lawyers in the team. So I don't know whether that's going to be 80-20, 90-10, 75-25. It will all depend on your where you are globally, spend-wise, complex-wise. But to have people with the right skills, not just lawyers, ideally not called non-lawyers, as well. So, legal operations professionals, data analysts, procurement, supply management people, legal project managers. So people with finance and data analyst skills, able to speak the language of business and finance, but still understanding lawyers and the legal world, because those people will be able to demonstrate ROI very easily. And it would be great to think that, all these people will come together as a team and there will be mutual respect from A to B.
And why do you think it's important to have that diversity of skill sets?
Oh, well, because a lot of lawyers, you are taking them out of their comfort levels to say, please go and do Excel, please go and do this on the computer, please move into contract automation. If they want to do it, great. And you're always going to get a percentage who will say, actually, I embrace all that. I'm an ex-lawyer who moved into procurement, who moved into operation, who's left altogether to become a consultant. So I embrace change to keep myself alive. But if people don't want to do that, then you're going to have to get in the people with the right skills. I think there has to be an acceptance that not everyone wants to embrace this new world. So do move on the people who are prepared to. But if you can't find them, I'm meeting quite a lot of lawyers actually who are thinking about going into legal operations, procurement, data analysis, all of this technology, because these are now valid professions. And I think will become so more and more. I know it's happening in the States before it's happening here, but I hope that the UK and EMEA will catch up.
And question to Stephanie. So in the teams that you see, kind of what do those skill sets generally look like?
I think with the newer lawyers, you are seeing people who, in fact, I just taught a class at Bucerius Law School in Hamburg, Germany about 2 weeks ago. And it was filled with mid-level and junior, kind of newer, several years out of law school folks. 30 students from 22 different countries, and they were so fascinated in this topic. In fact, they all took this legal operations course, and it was artificial intelligence, and they had a bunch of speakers who are pretty prominent here in the U.S. Dan Katz out of Kent Law School, Dan Lena out of well, he just left Michigan. I think he's at Northwestern now, but some big names asked us to come in and teach about legal operations. And so it was really interesting to me to see the interest with all of these students who are so fascinated in learning about artificial intelligence and how technology and operations and process improvements and Six Sigma and all of that stuff could really speed the delivery of legal services. At the end of the day, that's what you're trying to do with all of this, right? Is just get the services to the clients quicker. It's all about better, faster, cheaper. And so I think right now I'm really starting to see a lot of lawyers who are have this as an interest and who really do want to embrace it. I think Sarah's right that not everybody does want to get on board. We see sometimes, our law firms are really dragging their feet with this, and some of the lawyers who've been in-house for a long time don't necessarily want to get on board and are not eager to make the changes. But it's coming. It's inevitable. I mean, I'm definitely seeing it more and more. And I think one of the more interesting trends that I'm seeing is tiny law departments, like with solo GCs or 4 or 5 employees, and they're already starting to embrace these operational principles. And they're not waiting till there are 40 people in the department. They're doing it now. So it's definitely not just a trend. I mean, it's definitely happening.
Perhaps a question to Lucy. So I know, Lucy, you've kind of sat a little bit on the other side of the table, sort of working with a legal technology business. To that second question, how might technology change the picture? Where does technology actually fit in here? It's obviously not the answer to everything, but how do you see that changing the legal department of the future?
So I think the first thing that's happened so far with technology is that it's had a great impact in kind of what I've been calling the back office of legal, right? The operational infrastructure that's needed, whether it's e-billing, document management systems, right? Kind of your infrastructural technology has made leaps and bounds. There's still a long way to go, but there's been leaps and bounds. What we're seeing now is, of course, technology moving into the front office. It's moving into the lawyer work itself. It's taking on some of the analytical aspects, certainly in the context of, document review or contract review. It's taking on some analytics, even when it comes to, preparation of documents and the creation of materials. So I think what's going to happen is, as we see the success in the back office and how it's so logical, just like email logically transform the way people communicate, there's technology is transforming how departments are run, but the next step is that it is becoming an enabler to the attorneys. I'm a big fan of the concept of enabling attorneys, as opposed to this fear of robo-lawyers taking over and all that sensational nonsense in the legal press. It is nonsense. Some lawyers might be displaced, but frankly, those are probably the lawyers that shouldn't be getting paid what they pay to do that kind of work that right now you can automate. So that is going to happen more and more, because it's just going to become very obvious to those who are in charge of the resources for the department. And that might be somebody in the legal operations role, it might be a COO, whoever that is, that's suddenly going to realize that the cost of the resource is extremely high. Technology will be a natural place that they're going to look, and frankly, they might skip over entirely kind of alternative legal service providers and lower cost human resources to the extent they can implement technology. I think technology is doing a great job in pushing curiosity. It's doing a great job in forcing people to ask questions. It may not be solving problems quite yet, but it's certainly forcing fascinating conversations.
And Lucy, to some of those more extravagant claims that we hear in the press around lawyers being replaced, and at absolute worst, the image of the robot lawyer, which seems to be horribly perpetuated. To go to the next question of, does legal education need to change? What do you think the law students of today need to do to prepare for their careers tomorrow?
Yeah, absolutely, it needs to change. I think there's a lot that's being done already. There are law schools that are every day. There's a new law school that's kind of creating a new program or concentration or new courseware around some of these related skill sets. So every law student should be able to come out of law school and understand how to map a basic process. They should be able to read basic financial documents. They should understand what benefits technology can bring. I mean, there's this set of related skills that every law student should have an appreciation of. They don't need to be experts in it. They don't need to be green belts in Six Sigma, but they need to understand how those things can all come into play into the legal practice that they're about to embark on. And then if I could just take 30 seconds, I'd say legal education needs to change after law school. We've got right now hundreds of thousands of attorneys who have another 15, 20 years of practice left in them, who are largely, if not completely unaware of what is happening around them. And that's a very dangerous place to be, not just for them, but for their clients and their customers. So we have an education gap that's pretty serious right now. I'm afraid it's actually more of a gap in the professional education landscape than now some of the law schools who are catching up and are becoming much more competitive because they are offering these added skills.
And Sarah, I mean, how did you see that in practice? So, I mean, you've led a legal operations team and now work with them. So in terms of people that you would hire, so your hiring strategy, what kind of things did you look for in legal operations?
Well, I was lucky enough to only hire a data analyst, but when I hired a data analyst with proper data analyst skills, absolutely nothing to do with the law whatsoever, because it's completely and utterly different, you know. And he came on with no experience of legal ops at all, but he had massive data analyst and financial and pivot tables and all that I dreamed of having, and beautiful PowerPoints. He could do all that, and then you just train that person to understand what it's like to work in a legal field. And now talking to other teams, now I'm self-employed, it is all very much about, don't necessarily just think you need to hire a lawyer, hire someone else who can fill in all the gaps in your team. So I think a lot of GCs are beginning to think, actually, I can hire people with different skills to actually plug these gaps, far more than just thinking about, shall we get a trainee, shall we get a paralegal? Actually think outside the box, you know, hire someone with completely different skills, but then also do integrate them into the team. Don't just think of them as support staff.
Makes sense. And this is actually, I think, a nice segue to jump into the questions from the audience. So the first question we've had, and thank you for submitting these, is what kind of background does the ideal legal ops hire have? Maybe put that to Stephanie.
It's a great question, and we see it very greatly. And people often ask me, you know, does it need to be a lawyer? And I guess, you know, I always say no, because I'm not a lawyer. I have a business background. I have a degree in economics and a master's in business, and I never stepped foot into a legal department before I joined HP. But I think, you know, having that operations training, that constant drive to improve processes, having somebody, I'm going to steal Lucy's terminology here. She always says this, that person with the mutant gene, the attorney with the mutant gene. It certainly can be an attorney, but somebody who really enjoys change, first of all, like Sarah was discussing. There has to be somebody who is okay with change, somebody who really wants to drive change and see that process, those process improvements. Somebody who's not afraid of technology, obviously, and somebody, I think, with the right soft skills is also really critical. And so I think having somebody who can do the analysis is equally as critical, but having somebody who can do it with the right touch is something that is sometimes tough to find, because this person is kind of the face and the voice of the legal department often. They're acting on behalf of the general counsel in many cases. They're liaising with the other departments, and they're often getting the department to kind of swallow things that they don't necessarily want to swallow. You know, hey guys, today we're going to, you know, this is what we're going to be doing. And so having the right touch there so that people are willing to get on board, I think, is really critical too. So it's definitely a mix of skills. I think that's what you need to be successful in this role.
Stephanie, one of the phrases you used there, which I like, was comfort with change. Maybe a question to, well, either Sarah or Lucy, but how have you seen the relationship between the legal ops people within the team and the legal counsel? Because that comfort with change, I say this as an ex-lawyer, may not be something that is often associated with the lawyers in the team.
Well, Lucy, I don't know about you, but I have been accused of being a change agent in a rather cross conversation. You know, you're nothing but a change agent, which I embrace, because I have to admit, I don't think that you can completely transform a legal team, which is kind of what you're enabling the GC to do, without being a change agent. And you know, the clock people will always say, won't they, that you need to be quite a thick-skinned pit bull to do work like this. And I think that's true. You've got to have the end game in sight, and you've got to get it done. But obviously trying to bring people along with you as much as you can would be my advice. And as to the point as to, I think the lawyer, non-lawyer point as to being in legal ops, we could talk about it for hours. The only thing I think that, if you're in an old-fashioned organization where some of the lawyers want you to have a credible presence, I think those organizations will prefer you to be a lawyer, because I've met people who've actually said, are you a lawyer? Oh yes, you are an ex-lawyer, good. But I agree with Stephanie that in terms of the skill set, you really don't need to be a lawyer. You just need to have a big appreciation of the legal world, you know.
Does that chime with you, Lucy?
It does. I think there's also opportunity right now to create this the mutant that that Stephanie was talking about. I'm a strong believer that you don't have to be a lawyer to run legal ops by any means, but I think there's great opportunities for lawyers to actually become great legal ops people. I think there are lawyers who have it in them that maybe aren't in love with the way they're practicing things today, that have this, that can be exercised and can flourish. I do think there's right now still a translation that is necessary, and oftentimes being an attorney helps bring the other attorneys along, and that's what we've been hearing. And unfortunately, that's still the reality. And the decision makers in the legal departments are oftentimes still going to be the general counsel. At law firms, they're certainly going to be the managing partner. So it just helps the conversation move along. And like Sarah said, that credibility, where just to get you in the door, and then you can switch over into legal ops without them noticing. But right now, I think having the legal experience helps, especially when you're making substantive decisions that can impact something that's really close to, the legal aspects. And there is overlap, like in contracting, right? There is overlap as opposed to maybe in some other areas. So it's a fine line depending on what, again, the interests are for that department, whether being a lawyer helps or is necessary or not at all in many cases.
Thanks, Lucy. So we're going to move on to the next question. So do the new alternative providers have a role to play in helping you be data-driven? And it mentions legal process outsourcing and alternative legal service providers. So I think probably outside of the pure software context, but just to some of these new legal service models. Sarah?
Well, absolutely, because they're all over it. I mean, especially given it was only a few days ago that we heard about EY buying Riverview Law Kim technology. The ALSPs, or the alternatives, or the law companies, whatever you want to call them, have been set up specifically to work in the way that clients want legal services delivered. So when you talk to them about data reporting, analysis, bar charts, pie charts, etc., they're literally all over it. So almost any legal tech product you have now, the second word they'll sell you when they talk about selling it to you is it comes with reporting facilities. So it's interesting, and some of the law firms are of course catching up with this, and they're trying to keep up with the alternatives, but they're the legal operations people's best friends. I'm sure we'll probably all agree on that, won't we?
Yeah. Steph, do you see this thing happening in the US?
Sorry, was that directed to me or Lucy?
To you, Stephanie.
Yeah, I mean, I think the alternative service providers, like Sarah is saying, it's a no-brainer. They're set up out of the gate, ready to prepare this data for you. They've got the technology in place. They've got the analytics in place. And so you can definitely leverage them to do this for you.
I'm just going to come on to what will probably be the last question, just a couple of minutes to go now. So the question is, can regulation help to establish the need to be data-driven if regulators demand certain metrics, data, etc.? It's a tough question. So I'll maybe put that to Lucy.
Yeah, well, it definitely can, because it's just going to continue to open up the players, open up the the number of players and the type of players that are going to come into legal services. I don't think change in regulation is going to change the lawyers' perspective, the day-to-day practicing lawyers at the law firms, because they're fine. They feel already safe. What they're going to realize is when the competition continues to get tougher and they're going to start losing work to different types of service providers, only then will that force their change. So it won't be a natural, immediate change, but it will only happen by virtue of creating competition. And I think it's happening already.
Great, thanks, Lucy. So we've come up to the hour. I just want to thank the panel for joining us today. So to Sarah Barrett, Lucy and Stephanie Corrie. We will be posting a link to these slides and a recording of the webinar, and you'll receive an email after this for that. Finally, we'll be continuing the discussion on Twitter, hopefully some lively debate there, LinkedIn, and on our blog at blog.juro.com. Thank you to everyone for listening in, and hope to see you on the next one.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.